Welcome to the History Slam podcast from ActiveHistory.ca. Here's your host, Sean Graham.
Thank you, Adam. Welcome to the History Slam, everybody. I am Sean Graham coming at you today, nearly live from Ottawa, Ontario. It is June here, and the tourists are starting to come back here to the National Capital Region. Even some school trips. One of the longtime staples of spring life here in Ottawa is walking past or through Parliament Hill and seeing tons of 8th graders assembled, going to parliaments, going to the National War Memorial, going to wherever it is that they're going to. They have started to come back here in the nation's capital. And I wanted to talk about the resumption of tourism, the significance of it, and fortunately, there is a new book that addresses the history of tourism in one of Canada's most beautiful provinces, that is Prince Edward Island. It's a new book by Alan McEachern and Ed McDonald entitled The Summer Trade, A History of Tourism on Prince Edward Island. The book traces the tourism industry, the growth of that industry from the mid-19th century, really from Confederation through to the pandemic. And as they talk about on the show, the epilogue that they were planning on just got longer and longer as we went through COVID, and they addressed some of the issues that came out of the pandemic as the tourism industry, certainly as it was everywhere, was reeling, and what that meant for PEI, for the larger economy of the island. So this book does go through, obviously, a very long period, but it's fascinating to see the transition and the growth of tourism on the island from its early stages in the 19th century, and how things like transportation and the ability to get around the island and get to the island change the way in which people approach the tourism industry, both the visitors who are coming and those who are on the island, as well as, of course, the bridge that's built in the late 1990s, the Confederation Bridge that gets you across without having to take a ferry. Things like Anne of Green Gables, of course, is a big tourist draw. But then there's also a lot of tension there culturally within the local communities. How much does tourism impact the local culture? Is there resentment to tourists coming and kind of overtaking some communities across the island? Then there's, of course, the environmental considerations. So you see at times there is hostility, resistance to tourism, but then when it goes away, as we saw in the spring of 2020, there's this question of, well, how do we get it back? And it's really this back and forth, the pull and push of tourism and its impact on the island. It's a wonderful book. I really enjoyed the opportunity to go through it. And Alan and Ed were nice enough to join me, of course, remotely. Ed is a professor at UPEI, so he was out in Charlottetown. Alan is a professor at Western, so he was in London. But it was great that we were able to all gather from various parts across the country and across time zones. Really enjoyed this conversation. I think you will as well. So let's get right into my chat with Alan McEachern and Ed McDonald. All right, and Alan McEachern and Ed McDonald join me now from their respective locations. I assume, guys, Alan, you're in London, and Ed, you are in Charlottetown?
That's correct.
That's right.
All right.
Hi, Ed. Hi, Sean.
Well, welcome to the show, guys. Thank you so much for doing this. As I said in the intro, here to talk about the summer trade, a history of tourism on Prince Edward Island. And let me just start with a question that I've always wanted to know, and it seems to vary island to island. Are you on islands or are you in an island?
I wrestle with that as a writer. I'm in a province, but I'm on an island.
Right. So there's no real right answer, is there?
Yeah, I think you're in Australia. Are you on Greenland? I think it depends on the size of the island somewhat. But we did fight about this, and we may even fought a little with the press about this, about what they would decide to call us on or in.
And it may even have something to do with what sounds right to the ear, depending on whether the word island appears in the name of the island.
Oh, yeah, good. That's a good point. Yeah. Yeah, it'd be weirder to be on Australia. Maybe?
Yeah.
But on Vancouver Island, on Montreal Island,
right?
You're on Newfoundland. I don't know where you are when you're in Iceland, whether you're on Iceland or in it.
Do you have any more questions, Sean, or are we just going to talk about this for the whole time? That's fine.
Let's talk about the grammar. The grammar of the title. That's what we're going to focus on.
It's a great first title.
It's a metaphysical kind of thing, and I think that's worth asking when we're talking about an island and tourism on an island.
So yeah, as we say, the book is about, of course, tourism on Prince Edward Island, stretching from Confederation, so mid-19th century, up until the 21st century and the onset of COVID. And let's sort of take this chronologically, because I'm curious about the early stages of tourism on Prince Edward Island in that mid-late 19th century, because you do have certainly the big political things going on in Charlottetown around the era of Confederation. So people are certainly going there. But what did tourism look like at that time? And in particular, who could go to Prince Edward Island? What type of person would venture onto the island?
Those are excellent questions. And I mean, I think that's one of the things that you fight with. I mean, I trying to write about where tourism starts is really difficult, because as soon as you pick a date, as soon as you pick this guy was the first tourist, then you find someone who came 5 years earlier. Tourism is sneaky that way. I mean, it kind of, the locals don't see it coming to some extent. And I think that's what happened on Prince Edward Island in the late 19th century. The first people who probably came in any kind of numbers to the point that people were starting to accommodate them literally and figuratively, there were the starts of seaside resorts in the 1870s. And, there's a good tradition of that kind of creeping up the northern or the eastern seaboard of the U.S. and then coming to Canada. And certainly well off from central Canada, well off from the eastern states.
I think part of the question about when something like this would actually start has to do with a self-awareness as well. There's a progression in some of the literature on tourism about the explorer and then the traveler and then the tourist. And that's from the point of view of the tourist. But from the point of view of, the host, it becomes, when do you become aware that you would like to attract these people who come to visit? And for islanders, that's a gradual sort of dawning. And by the 1870s, there are a small number of islanders who are thinking, hey, this could be something.
Does the Charlottetown Conference, does that actually mark any sort of point in this, that it's a large gathering, a lot of people from central Canada come? There's certainly reasons why they choose Charlottetown, but does that result in anything, sort of the press of, hey, look, all these people went to Charlottetown? Is there some offshoot there locally of people realizing, hey, this is a moment where we can attract people like coming here, this is a beautiful place to be? Can we lean into that a little bit?
I think Ed has something he wants to say. I can really tell. He's biting.
I was just thinking that Charlottetown Accord 1992 did not give a bump to tourism. So the Charlottetown Conference 1864 may have raised the profile of Charlottetown. And it is true that, when the delegates got a day off, what did they do? They drove to the North Shore. They sightseed, if that's a verb. But Alan, what are your thoughts on that? Since we don't have to agree just because we're co-authors.
We do start the book with that, Sean, and it's kind of as a joke about them, Fathers of Confederation being early tourists, and they are. But I don't think that there was a kind of groundswell of tourism after that, a ripple effect of other central Canadian politicians or other central Canadians as a result of this. It wasn't quite the Canadian invasion, I guess you would say.
Right.
And we had a lot of visitors here during the conference, but it wasn't because of the conference. It was because there was a circus in town, and it was the first one in 21 years.
Another circus, but bump.
Yeah.
Oh, well, that kind of leads to a question of, when we're talking about tourism, what about tourism within PEI? People going from one part of the island to another part of the island. How do we sort of assess that? I think oftentimes tourism, and especially in the East Coast, where if you're not from here, you're from far away. How do we assess the tourism domestically within PEI versus people coming from the mainland?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I think that intramural tourism like that is really sometimes what keeps tourism alive when it's in its early stages. Is the fact that people are coming and maybe they're not staying overnight. Maybe there were no staycations in the 1870s, but maybe they're coming for tea and lunch and things like that to some of these resorts. But one of the things I think it's fair to say, Ed, that we found in studying this is that nobody through the entire history of tourism on Prince Edward Island paid any attention to islanders, at least until maybe the 21st century. That there was no kind of thoughts about them of staycations being a real kind of a part of the industry. They were taken for granted if their existence was even noticed at all.
Yeah, I think partly it's a function of size. So if you live in Oshawa and you go to Ottawa, you're a tourist. Mm-hmm. But if you live in Charlottetown and you go to Surrey and stay overnight, we didn't think of you as a tourist. And it's only in the last 10 or 15 years that really the tourism industry and PEI started to include that kind of tourism in their stats. But it's true, though, as well, Alan, when you were charting some of the earliest ads for establishments on the North Shore, they're advertising to islanders who might want to come and get away from the city for a few days on the coast. Mm-hmm. So in a sense, there's an awareness that islanders might come to their hotels, mm-hmm. but they really weren't aiming any of their marketing for the most part at islanders. And we didn't start to count them until really recently.
Well, that's interesting to think of it that way. And it's a good point to think Oshawa to Ottawa versus within the island and just sort of the size of it all. The other part that I'm wondering is the seasonality of it. Of course, the book is the summer trade. And given that it's an island and it's hard to get to and probably harder to get to in the winter, is there a change in who might visit somewhere summer to winter? Like, is there more value potentially in domestic visitors during the winter, whereas in the summer, the focus really was on bringing people from away to the island, and that therefore that could account for some of that discrepancy or not thinking about the local population as much in those statistics?
Sean, have you been here in the winter?
No, I've only been in the summer.
Well, when you think of what the attraction is in the winter for tourism, the island struggles to meet that. Do you ski? We don't have, well, we have a ski hill, and it is a hill, not a mountain. Our winter weather's not reliable enough for snow sculptures. And we've tried, and it's been a mantra for what, Alan? A century maybe, or half a century, to expand the shoulders of the season. Tourism has narrow shoulders on Prince Edward Island, and to get people to come in the winter. And there have been numerous experiments about trying to launch some kind of event tourism that would get people to come here in the winter. But it has been and remains the summer trade. I had all kinds of great ideas as a title for the book, and Alan said, I think it should be called The Summer Trade. And I had to go, yep, you're right.
Well, thank you. That's the first and only time he's ever said I was right about anything in this book. Yeah, I mean,
for publicity's sake, I'm
right.
calling him right now.
That's right. I think for the sake of the tourism industry, I think would love to have June and September and maybe dribble into October, but they've never really ever thought beyond those months. Like that's about as wide as those shoulders are ever going to get.
Yeah. And there's always been a problem for tourism on Prince Edward Island. Spring as a season is notoriously unreliable in terms of weather. Fall is a great season on Prince Edward Island, but the destination has always been a family destination. And what happens in September? Well, the kids go back to school. Right. And so it's only when marketing on PEI started to target dinks, the double income, no kids, mm-hmm. that they see much opportunity to grow the shoulder season, but it still has been a struggle. I mean, I worked in the museum industry and in the tourism industry in the 1980s and 90s, and the government would put in place programs to try to get places to open earlier, but nobody came because nothing was open. Right. Nothing was open because nobody came. And so it really has been a struggle, but there's opportunity in the spring and fall, but probably not in January and February. And of course, in the early days, you couldn't get here in the winter.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's part of what I wanted to talk about. When you get into the 20th century and transportation changes, both in terms of maybe navigating the water and being able to get to the island, but also things become more reliable in terms of rail service. So maybe people can come from a little further away or from other parts of North America or even potentially Europe as the ships become faster and faster. And then, of course, once you get into air travel, things become even more accessible. How do the changes in transportation through the 20th century, in particular that first half of the 20th century, as we really have the advent of more reliable ships, trains, and then airplanes, how does that change the face of tourism? And is that part of that sneaking into the culture that you referenced a little earlier, that it kind of happens around you, almost like was it the frog in the boiling water a little bit, that you don't quite notice it until it's done?
I think you could talk about all of those. You could talk about ships and planes and trains, but to me, you got to talk about automobiles, because I think the automobiles from the let's say, really 1920s on, it doesn't only increase the number of people coming to Prince Edward Island, but it basically makes the entire island an attraction, that you can go to every single little pocket. And of course, this doesn't only apply to Prince Edward Island, it applies to lots of places in Canada and elsewhere as well. But that every place is opened up to tourism in a way that it had never been before. And I think that changes things both for hosts and guests.
I think there's another aspect to this as well. The automobile changes the nature of tourism as well. People used to come to a resort and you stayed at that place for weeks, perhaps months. The automobile basically makes tourism a moving sort of thing. People are mobile, but that creates a bottleneck in terms of getting on and off, the island. And the story of the century is in large part a story of greater and greater, demand and traffic as people travel by automobiles more and more, and they can't get across to the island or get off, the island, which is bad for tourism. But the other aspect of transportation, I think, is the fact that the passage to an island is a visceral part of being a tourist to an island. How do you know you've come to an island? The crossing over water. And tourism films always like to promote the sea voyage involved in traveling for about an hour on a ferry across a strait. But it's been both a benefit and it's been a problem. But within the island, once a tourist gets here, as Alan says, the whole island becomes a destination.
We'll jump ahead. I want to get back to the mid-century a little bit, but because we're talking about cars, let's jump ahead to the bridge and the construction of the Confederation Bridge and how much that impacts the tourism trade. I've driven across it once. When I went to the island, I took the bridge. And when I got off the island, I took a ferry. I made the mistake of trying to read on the ferry, and the water was a little rough that day. That was a poor decision on my part. But I have been across the bridge. But is the bridge essentially a tourism bridge? I know that there's a lot of other things that go across the bridge, a lot of trucks, sort of transportation of goods and stuff. But is it essentially a tourism bridge?
By the way, this is the anniversary today of the opening, the 25th anniversary, apparently, of the opening of the bridge.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was all over the radio this morning. Probably not national news, but it was local news. Yeah. Alan, what are your thoughts on that? I probably have a few thoughts, having been one of the ones who walked across that bridge and spent 9 hours in lineups on that day.
Well, you sound like you have more of a story. I would say just in terms of the numbers, like it's absolutely clear that tourism numbers shot up. Tourism numbers are notoriously difficult, especially, well, for a lot of reasons, but they're notoriously difficult to figure out exactly how many people are coming year in, year out, especially when numbers tend to be measured differently over time. But it's crystal clear that the number of visitors to the island skyrocketed after the bridge, from probably averaging around 600,000 or 700,000 people per year in the 1990s, almost immediately to about 1.2, 1.3 million. So an increase of about 500,000. And I think that the sheer number of the rise of tourists generally over the last century is basically one of the key parts to our story. Like a century ago, in 1920, there were maybe 10,000 tourists on PEI, and now there's 1.6 million. So it is increased so much faster than the population has increased, and putting so much more pressure on the population on Prince Edward Island and on the island itself.
Yeah. Now, whether the bridge itself is a tourist attraction is harder to say. It's a boring thing to drive across, and yet it's a beautiful thing to see from a distance. It's quite impressive. And a lot of people like to drive across the bridge to say that they crossed, the bridge. But the ferry also was an attraction if you were able to get on it in a timely way.
But all that being said, though, does the bridge represent what the book kind of traces, the culmination of PEI to not a full reliance on, but certainly an increased reliance on tourism? Is the bridge a physical manifestation of this transition of PEI from a more self-contained cultural and economic environment to one that really does depend on outsiders coming in?
That's a great question. I want to hear Ed answer it first.
That process was already well underway by the time the bridge was constructed. But the debate over the bridge, and as you probably know, there was a debate for 5 years about whether or not there should be a fixed link and what the impact of the link would be. Part of the argument, part of the gut feeling or resistance to the concept of a fixed link, existential worry about what it would do to the islandness of the society and the culture. But that would imply that before the bridge was constructed, that the island was more or less isolated and its culture was somehow insulated from outside influences. And that's true in 1920 and is probably true in 1950. But I don't think it's true by 1990.
So is the drawbridge coming down?
It's just, there are lots of arguments for and against the bridge, but the arguments against the bridge came down to two things: environmental impact, but that was expedient because that was the argument most likely to succeed. The opposition to it in many cases was instinctual. Some of it was economic. People were going to lose their jobs. The people that worked on the ferry were going to lose their jobs. But a lot of it was concern about what it would do to the essential nature of Prince Edward Island. And since no one can define that, it's hard to define the way that it has evolved since the bridge, when the bridge isn't the only thing that's changed. It's a variable, but it's only one variable. But I've lived here through that entire time, and the island had completely transformed from when I was a kid, well before the bridge was built. I'm older than Alan, so I can say that with some authority. But it is a watershed moment, Sean. It is what we chose in the beginning when we planned the book. We're ending with the fixed link because it was the recent past. And in the end, we decided to add an epilogue. And the epilogue became longer and longer as it took us longer and longer to get to press. Because Alan thought it was important, and I think he was right, to try to get as close to the present as possible while still being historians. Mm-hmm. So the bridge, I think you're right, the bridge is important. It's a watershed moment. If a bridge can be a watershed, I don't know. But I think it's easy to overestimate its impact.
Sean, you have to ask us about COVID then, because of course, the epilogue, there was no way we could publish a book in 2022 that would end in, let's say, 2018 and pretend that COVID wasn't part of this story, because COVID most certainly is part of this story.
Yes, and we will get to COVID. I do have a couple questions about that. But I want to go back a little bit to what you mentioned, Ed. You said 1920, 1950, the culture of the island maybe is a little isolated. The book, one of the chapters goes through the 60s to the 80s, sort of this optimistic era around the island. But it really does seem like this is a turning point for the island in its tourism industry and culturally. So what are some of the cues that you guys found in your research that notice not only just the tourism, the increased tourism dependence, but those little cultural things that are starting to seep in that maybe are taking away a little bit of that original island culture that becomes so romanticized by tourists. But how does that all work together where it starts to be challenged or chipped away at through that particular 20-year period in the early part of the second half of the 20th century?
I have argued elsewhere that the years of the development plan, 1969 to 1984, was the hinge on which the century turned on Prince Edward Island. So the forces of change and modernization, which, I mean, change is always a constant. We like to think that things don't change, and then all of a sudden things change rapidly. But change accelerated after the Second World War, especially. And the development plan was an attempt to rationalize, modernize the island's economy so that we would cease to be a have-not province. But to do that, the plan needed to transform the society and the culture as well. It was, a comprehensive plan, and the pieces were meant to be interlocking. And so tourism was a big part of the formula. As a new industry that had been growing rapidly, it was a service industry. And a lot of islanders resented the emphasis during the development plan on the tourism industry. And I think they were a little bit worried by all of the bragging from the Minister of Tourism that the tourism industry would soon be the number one industry on Prince Edward Island. Well, agriculture had always been the number one industry. And the island was predominantly, it was a rural society. Its culture had been shaped by the rural economy. And its tourism marketing built on that idea of a pastoral landscape with a pastoral kind of underlay of people. And so you can measure in little increments changes in the terminology, changes in the marketing and advertising, but the development plan really accelerates and tries to manage that change. Mm-hmm. Some people would like to observe that really the history of the island since the war is going to become, vacation land and holiday island from a place that had been known for being a potato island, the Spud Island, Spud Islanders, and now we're Holiday Island. What does that say about us?
I think what I would add to that is that I think you see it kind of on both sides. You see in terms of the promotion itself. The promotion is, there's kind of an attempt to modernize tourism promotion and to be more hip in ways that are sometimes kind of radically unsuccessful. And the one that springs to mind, there's a couple of years in the mid-1970s where the annual tourist guide for put out by the provincial government had a centerfold. There was one year in particular, it was right out of the Sports Illustrated swimsuit issue. Like, it was just kind of terrible, and it didn't really speak to Prince Edward Island at all. It was kind of like an attempt to become kind of hip and with it to the rest of the continent that I think even at the time kind of, stank of being inauthentic. And I think that also in this period, you say between the 60s and 80s, one of the themes that we have kind of running throughout this book that we kept finding, and it was kind of a short form that we used when Ed and I, between Ontario and Prince Edward Island, we referred to this thing called hospitality, which was anytime we found evidence of islanders kind of pushing back against tourism promotion or tourism or sometimes individual tourists. And I think that was most evident in the 70s. There was a local, what would you call them, kind of a local protest group called the Brothers and Sisters of Cornelius Howitt. And a lot of their protests were based on kind of anti-tourism promotion and what the promotion of tourism meant, when the degree to which Prince Edward Island, in terms of private enterprise, in terms of the state, was pushing tourism. And they really pushed back against it. And so we probably found the greatest evidence of hospitality in that period from 1960 to 1980.
And as you guys are talking too, I was thinking, I grew up in the 90s, and one of the things that oftentimes you'd come back to school in September, and inevitably there'd be one or two people who would wear their PEI Dirt Shirts that they got during a summer vacation. And that strikes me as one of those things too that both ties in with the idea of PEI as agricultural and tying those things together, while simultaneously being something that no PEI kid would ever wear to school. I would imagine that there's no chance that a local kid would ever wear that shirt, I would think, right? So it almost like those two things tie together.
That's fair.
It's
we're
curious.
all wearing Maple Leaf t-shirts or something like that.
Right.
It's curious because, the dirt shirt was a bit of a witticism, because if you live on Prince Edward Island, Red Island dirt is hard to get out of your clothing, especially white clothing. So the stains tend to stay. So this was taking a lemon and turning it into some kind of touristic, lemonade. But it highlights the fact as well that PEI traditionally has been a family vacation spot. So when I went away to school and started meeting folks from other areas of Canada and North America, if they'd been to Prince Edward Island, it was almost always as a child. Oh yeah, my parents took me there when I was 9. It's not some place that you went when you were 22, unless you were with someone who was a fan of Anne of Green Gables and were drawn to that, or unless you had friends. Like I had friends who would come and see me on Prince Edward Island. But it's always been a family spot, and the dirt shirt played to that. The cows, different kinds of merchandise from cows, but they too cater to shirts for kids.
I'll say I did go for the first time when I was 29. It was a family trip, though. When we went to play golf, that's why we went. So that's sort of the other
garden of the golf.
That's right, yeah. And it was great. But one of my favorite things, we went to a course. They just had at the end of the round in the clubhouse a cooler full of mussels, and it was just all you can eat mussels. Just go in, scoop up the mussels and eat them. It was great. We spent an hour there. Could have spent longer, but my mom is allergic to seafood, so she was just sitting there watching us.
By the way, this is nice advertising, Sean. This is nice advertising for the island that you're doing right now.
Yeah,
Island blue mussels, golf.
Delicious. The weather was great. We didn't get any rain for the 5 days we were there. It was absolutely amazing. Now, Ed, you did mention Anne. You can't really talk about tourism on PEI without talking about Anne of Green Gables and the significance of that story and everything that is built up around it. But let's just start with, how do locals feel about Anne and the cultural significance of Anne that draws people to the island?
Well, I'm going to give Alan first crack at this, because Alan has been more a scholar of Anne and tourism around Anne, and I'm a bit cynical as well about Lucy Maudlin, Montgomery.
Yeah,
although I'm a great admirer of her work, actually. So, Alan, what would you say?
Oh, you're going to ask the questions now, Ed. Okay.
Yeah.
I guess I would say this. I would say that from the moment Anne of Green Gables was written and published in 1908, it has helped the island tourism industry. And it was when Green Gables and the North Shore became not accidentally part of PEI National Park in 1936. It gave Prince Edward Island the Prince Edward Island tourism industry its first kind of attraction. And it has made the North Shore, it has made Cavendish, it has made Green Gables, the house, the real heart of Prince Edward Island tourism ever since. I think islanders have been very grateful, actually, for Anne of Green Gables. Because of how much money it's brought into the province, but also because it has focused most of the energy and most of the tourists up there in Cavendish. So for islanders themselves, it really gives them the option of, I'm going to go up to the North Shore if I want to be with the crowds, or I can just ignore the tourists, stay away from Cavendish. Yeah, that didn't sound very tourist. The tourism industry might not like that I just said that, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
I'm going to say a couple of more things that I think Alan would agree with. One is that the books we love the most, the books that stay in our hearts, are generally books that we read when we were small, And Anne of Green Gables and all the other books that were written by Montgomery aren't just liked by people, they were loved by people. And there's a wholesome quality to those books, but it's a little different than the kind of tourism loyalty that you would get if you were a fan of a book that you read as an adult. Then you have kind of an intellectual interest in coming to see this or that place associated with that book. So it being a children's book makes it especially addictive, if you will. The other thing I wanted to say is that one of the characters in the Montgomery books is the island.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Montgomery loved the island. Her books are full of descriptions of both the landscape of Prince Edward Island and the kind of pastoral island, culture that underlays it. And so, generally speaking, I think islanders do appreciate that. Would rather be known for Anne than for being the Kitten Club International kind of headquarters of North America. But from time to time, while grateful that it redirects tourists to the North Shore, I think from time to time, islanders get a little bit overwhelmed with so much Anne all of the time. And the branding of the island as the land of Anne. Having said that, we like to kid about it, and occasionally we snipe about it, but there are worse things to be famous for.
Does Anne draw a different tourist group than say golf or going around seeing the shores or things in Charlottetown? My guess, as being someone who doesn't fully know, is that Anne draws a more international crowd, whereas some of the other attractions on the island might cater more to a Canadian crowd. But perhaps I'm wrong, and please correct me if I'm wrong on that.
Well, I think we get tourists from Japan who come to PEI precisely because it's the home of Anne. But let me put it this way. There are lots of places that have pastoral landscape, lots of parts of the world which have warmish seawater, sandy beaches. But if you can combine those with being able to visit the home of a famous author and character, maybe that's a deciding point for families making a decision to come to Prince Edward Island. I won't say all Anne fans are women, because they're not. And I won't say that women are necessarily the people who make a decision about where families will go on vacation, although the research tends to say that's true. But that gives us undeniable advantage.
It's important to say that tourists don't have to decide, because it's small enough. You can golf one day. If it's raining, you go to Green Gables or something like that. And I like what you said earlier, Ed, about the connection, as a literary destination, there are children's books or books you read as a child that are important. There's not a whole lot of really famous literary childhood classics that are also literary destinations. There are some. I'm probably not thinking of them right at the moment. But I mean, you can't go to Hogwarts unless you go to Orlando. You can't go to Middle-earth, but you can go to Green Gables. And for some people, that's pretty attractive.
Well, it does lead to me wondering about the idea of repeatability then. And how many return visitors does a place like PEI, get? Because you can go, say, like, if you are a fan of Harry Potter and you want to go to Hogwarts, you can go to Universal in Orlando, and they're always changing things up. New attractions, new things. They're always trying to bring people back. You want those return visitors at a lot of these large tourist places. What does PEI do to get return visitors? And again, when we're talking about the cultural changes to the island, what impact does that have, the efforts to get people to come back?
I don't think this is going to be a full answer, but that's good, because there's another author here to answer that as well. But I would say that one of the things that tourist promoters are always dealing with are both to keep, and especially maybe a kind of, if you're Las Vegas, you need to reinvent yourself every couple of years. Prince Edward Island doesn't want to do that because it's selling instead kind of constancy, right? So there's, on the one hand, there's an attempt to kind of retain that constancy, to know that people are going, and to allow tourists and would-be tourists to know that when they come back, or that they can keep coming back, and they'll have kind of essentially the same experience. And yet there's also kind of a recognition, as you say, for repeatability. You want to offer some variety. So I think those two things are always at conflict. And frankly, that's why I think that our history of tourism on Prince Edward Island, I think tourism is a great way to look at the history of a place, because you have in a tourist destination like Prince Edward Island, you have everyone is involved in kind of every year identifying and redefining themselves, and then putting it out there. This is what we're like. This is what PEI is like. And if you trace that over the course of a century, you get to kind of watch the incremental changes, not just to how they're promoting themselves, but to the island itself. So I like to think of this history of tourism on PEI as really a history of PEI, because it shows the island kind of sweeping back the curtains and saying, this is us. This is what we are circa 1936. This is what we are circa 1954. And so you get to watch the island change.
I like what Alan said about the value of being able to offer a consistency experience that is consistently the same over time. So some people actually crave that, and many of them end up coming here and renting a place every year, or they build a summer home and they become a summer resident. However, it is true that the island has occasionally tried to take the foundation that it has built and add some wrinkles. You came here to golf, and particularly beginning in the 90s, for about a decade, the government and the marketing agencies pushed very hard to make us a destination for golfers. And in more recent times, it's been food. You're a foodie. Come to Prince Edward Island, food island, and get mussels, get that seafood, get this experience, not just of greasy hamburgers and French fries, but a food experience. So those are variations, but they build on an essential foundation that has been constant. And yeah, we have not reinvented ourselves because we haven't had to.
All right. Well, let's. There's so much more to talk about with this book and with tourism on PEI. But let's wrap with COVID and the COVID experience, and obviously the challenges presented by it. One of the things that comes up in the book is just the amount of people who work in the tourism industry, either directly or indirectly, supported by tourism. Of course, that essentially all goes away in the spring of 2020, and you lose 2 seasons of tourism. And I was wondering, as I was going through this part of the book and thinking about it, does the experience with COVID show some sort of a vulnerability of relying so much on tourism? And does that, in a certain way, almost justify the hand-wringing or the frustration that some locals have had in PEI over that reliance on tourism and the perceived damage that it may have done culturally, and then certainly in the past 2 years economically, that total reliance, not total reliance, but the increasing reliance on tourism?
I think it's unavoidable. Anything that's a major industry, even if you're not reliant on tourism, if it's not your only industry, having a major industry go down the way that it did on Prince Edward Island and globally exposes the fact that global tourism is it's a monster, but it's a fragile monster. It's made of glass. And it relies on certain things over which you have no control as a destination. One of them is safe travel, and the other is economics. And so there's a lesson to be drawn from that it's unwise to put all of your eggs in one basket. And I don't think the island has always put its eggs in one basket. One of the appeals that we make in the epilogue of the tourism book is that tourism involves making some decisions, not once, but every year. Decisions about who you want to be as a destination, how you want to promote yourself as a destination, and who you surrender control to. If you're an island, a small island, you need to keep the levers of agency in your own hands. Then, even with a pandemic, at least those things you can control, you will control, because there's so many things that you can't. And so I think the pandemic has been a reminder that agency is a hugely important element of tourism.
I think that's really well said, Ed. The only thing I would really add is that, not even really add, I think you kind of said this, perhaps I'll try it in a different way, is that the islanders really saw tourism, and of course a lot of people saw tourism as natural, as that it only went in one direction. It went up. So the question would only be like, how are we going to rein it in? How are we going to keep it from 5%, 10% gains per year? How are we going to keep it? How are we going to control it? And of course, they realized after 2020 that they also had to worry about it even existing, about whether, not whether it would go up slowly, but whether it would decline precipitously. And of course, there was nothing the Prince Edward Island or any tourism destination could really do in 2020 to keep that from happening, which raises some existential questions about the safety of the industry.
And sustainability. Sustainability is on everyone's lips. In 2018 and 19, it was at the other end of the spectrum. Over-tourism was on everyone's lips. There were places that were being trampled and degraded, and local people were losing, their neighborhoods and control over their neighborhoods. And then in 2020, it was like, oh my God, the bottom has gone completely out of the industry. Sustainability began to take on a new meaning. In the 1970s, sustainability was more a question of maintaining the resource that tourists would want to see. So maintaining the environment, maintaining the pastoral landscape, clean up your litter, get rid of the barge that sank with all the oil in it, watch the signage. In 2018, it was about how many tourists is too many tourists. In 2022, it's how do we get them back?
Right.
As I said, agency is an important element of that. Feeling like you have some control, because in the tourism industry, there's so much over which you have no control, even the weather.
And certainly with climate change, other threats to the island and its sustainability in a variety of other ways. There's a lot of factors certainly at play there. And this book, we've been talking for 47 minutes, and we've really only scratched the surface of some of the really key things in this book. So if you are from PEI, I think you'll enjoy this. If you are not from PEI and have been or want to go, you'll enjoy this. If you live somewhere that is a tourist area, I think there's a lot here to unpack within the book. So guys, The Summer Trade, A History of Tourism on Prince Edward Island. Where can people pick it up? And you guys have an exhibition going on at the Confederation Center of the Arts. So if you are tourisming in PEI this summer, you can check out the exhibit. So what are some of the details for folks out there who want to pick up the book and check out the exhibit?
So McGill Queen's University Press is the publisher. I happen to have a copy on my desk. It can be ordered through their website. And if they distribute across the country, no doubt you can order it through your local bookstore. It's available fairly widely on Prince Edward Island.
The exhibit is really the book in museum exhibit form, I think I would say. And we're really excited to be having it at the Confederation Center of the Arts, as you say, from June till October. And who knows, maybe there'll be even copies of the book there as kind of a supersized catalog for the exhibit, just if you happen to attend.
We'll link to everything in the show notes, or if you're over on Active History, check the post associated with this episode. Everything will be linked there for the book, the exhibition, if you want to check it out. So again, The Summer Trade, A History of Tourism on Prince Edward Island. Alan McEachern, Ed McDonald, thanks so much for doing this today, guys.
Thank you so
Sean.
much.
That was fun.
So there you have it. my chat with Alan McEachern and Ed McDonald. Again, The Summer Trade, A History of Tourism on Prince Edward Island, from our friends at McGill Queen's University Press. Encourage you to check it out. And if you are in Charlottetown, if you are on PEI, you can make your way to Charlottetown at the Confederation Center of the Arts, June 11th through October the 9th, if you want to see the exhibit. So that's going to do it for this week. Thank you so much for listening, everybody. If you have not yet, please do subscribe. Wherever it is you get your podcast, do likes, ratings, comments, all that good stuff. Helps other people find the show, keeps us growing. And of course, head on over to ActiveHistory.ca. All of our past episodes are there under the podcast tab. And of course, all the great written material over there on the site. I encourage you to check that out. Lots of fun stuff. Using the search bar on the website. A sneaky fun thing to do. If you got 20 minutes on your hand, and even less, you got 10 minutes on your hand, you're like, I just want to read something interesting. Head over to Active History. Put a term that you're interested in the search bar. Something will probably come up that you will find of interest. Lots of good stuff over there on the site. But of course, if you want to let me know what you would like to hear on this very show, historyslam@gmail.com. You can find me on Twitter at the Sean Graham. So with that, I will say thanks again for listening. Always appreciate it. We will be back with you again next week with another new episode. But until then, if you're out and you see Enrico Palazzo, please say hi for me.
Thanks for listening to the History Slam podcast. Be sure to check out Active History for more features, articles, and be sure to subscribe on iTunes.